Very much, Kay. I think this was a very comprehensive overview over all the hurdles, difficulties that have to be overcome when we want to integrate patients into the medicines development process. I think the reason to do it is quite clear. We have an ethical obligation. We know that in those cases where that worked well, where this was well done, let's say the attempts of pharma companies to move towards outcome-driven drug development is definitely supported by such an approach. The question is how to make it work. And we have a number of key hurdles that have been identified in the last couple of years, and that starts with the problem to make it really work within the companies, because especially the big pharma companies have now a patient engagement department, but very often this is not part of the clinical research or of the R&D department, but it's on the marketing side or in the patient communication side, and not where we would really need that direct and easy contact in the R&D department. And we know from Kay and her colleagues in many cases how difficult it is to get heard there, because of course these people have other burning issues to achieve. Number one, they are under big time pressure. Of course, we have to make sure that the protocols are as quickly as possible agreed, that the studies are set up, that first patient in comes as quickly as possible. So there's a permanent time constraint and struggle. And getting now in another group which is difficult to find, has to be educated, comes perhaps with different ideas, is disturbing the flow of thoughts so far, or is raising requests that are very difficult to achieve, of course, can be considered as, and is in fact probably also, certainly a type of considered as constraint and hindering, until there are ways to overcome that. But it's not only on the industry side, it's of course also on the patient side, because a lot of patient organizations refuse to talk to pharma companies, and it's forbidden to talk to pharma companies. And the patient organizations first have to do their homework as well, that it's really not possible to get things changed if you block any type of communication on it. The other problem that patient organizations have is the fact that as I mentioned before, they are not prepared to have these type of discussions. They don't know enough about understanding what it requires, what type of information is requested from them. So there are different areas that have to be overcome, that have to be managed, the matchmaking between pharma company and patient organizations, how to find each other, how to be able then to find the right type of patients for the right type of tasks. And as you have seen from this continuum, there are many different type of tasks, many different opportunities for getting patients involved. So the question is, what can be done to bring them together? And these guidelines and these, let's say, conflict of interest solutions and all these things that we try to, and that are under development, are all tools to improve and facilitate that interaction. But I mean, especially in the area of AIDS, a lot of these problems have been understood and worked towards already in the 90s. And this is really a very important success story. But from your view, what do you think, David, was the most difficult, or one of, let's say, the few most difficult things that patient organizations had to overcome, your patient organization had to overcome, your community, to be able to speak with pharma companies?
We didn't have big difficulties when we started because we were so emotional. And the pressure was so big, it just made sense. And what probably helped us too was that a lot of the early affected HIV patients came out of the gay liberation movement. They knew how to make a noise, and they knew how to make themselves heard. And the AIDS threat also brought a lot of unusual people together, unusual people on every side of the spectrum in drug development, at industry, among researchers. So the HIV community is something a bit peculiar, perhaps. Unusual people working together achieved a lot rather quickly. What astonished me later on when we went to hepatitis C, because a lot of HIV patients also live with hepatitis C, we were talking basically to the same companies doing hepatitis C drugs, but a different department, a different silo in that company. And I remember Roche needed the HIV department telling the hepatitis department how to work with patients. And they did that. So this showed me, heck, we have achieved something in HIV, but it doesn't work anywhere else, not even in the same company. And when the Opati project came along, I was excited because finally we could do A, something outside HIV, and B, something with all the companies, and that would help us to find solutions, to find tools, to find possibilities to make what we did in HIV a more broad thing. What I need to mention in between is that the regulators really have been pioneers in this area by reaching out to patients. The FDA, because they were knocked down by HIV patients in '88, so they moved their butt rather quickly. The EMA, a little later in the mid-90s, when we knocked at their door, and they said, oh, we don't talk to patients. But they then heard interesting things and had established an unofficial way of communicating with us and saw there is value we currently don't tackle. They set up a working party in 2003 that is now being very beneficial in putting patients everywhere in their decision-making processes. The FDA is now copying the European EMA model as well, and so the regulators have actually been driving the scene. And I would now like to see the companies doing the same and researchers doing the same across the spectrum. But that will take time. And it will also take time on the patient side, because some people have a lot to learn and have to learn the methods and the practices that are required to be successful in this environment.
Are there any questions? Yes, please.
From Mayo Clinic, and I'm happy to see that we had this patient session here, since I think patients form an essential part of the research ecosystem, also for academic research. And I know that a lot of the grant agencies in the US, such as the Department of Defense and now the NIH as well, they're starting to require that we have patient advocates in our grant proposals. So I was wondering, what is the situation in Europe and, for instance, China in regards to the requirement for patient advocates? Thank you.
Europe, I can answer.
If you want.
If you apply for research in Europe at the Commission and in Switzerland, you need to demonstrate that you are in touch with patients, or that patients are on board in some advisory capacity. This is a given, and this is getting stronger and stronger as a requirement. China, I think, is a different planet, and I know Japan is already a different planet. But there may be somebody in the audience.
All right. I think I'm one of the Chinese scientists in this meeting room. I think this is my first time heard about the patients, say, groups have such strong voice in a lot of things. But so far, I haven't heard about any grant agencies ask advice or suggestions from patient groups. And for the farmers, the situation is the same. I haven't heard about any voice from the patients. So, yeah, that's what I learned. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Yeah, it's certain. We have seen that the, let's say, proposals for public grants that have a patient platform, a patient advertisement, consulting platform in their proposal clearly have benefits. So also in IMI, we have seen that practically all projects that get IMI funding have a strong patient component. So I think here we have certainly signals in the right direction, but in many aspects it's also a bit of an alibi function still. And I see this also in FP7 or now Horizon 2020 funded projects. The colleagues from the different research areas meet, and then 2 weeks before deadline for submission, somebody says, oh my God, we need the patient, and oh my God, we need ethics. And that is when then patient representatives come into the boat, or people like us in EFGCP get requested, and that is then too late, because then it's not possible anymore to make those fundamental basic characteristics of that project that is required to really make it work. So we need to achieve that also in public funded projects. This idea we need patients needs to come together with that idea. We need to have the preclinical and the clinical and the lab people, etc. That needs to become a normal, systematic way of thinking if we really want to create very good proposals. And ultimately, also these publicly funded projects require a clear outcome. Those projects that are successful are those that really show very concretely what will come out and how do we get there. And I think patients help a lot by streamlining the thinking of what exactly is it that should come out afterwards. That is also presentable and measurable and showable. I don't know whether this word exists, but it's really helpful, but it should come much earlier. Yes, please.
Yeah, interesting talks. What I was thinking when I was listening to the talks was, I think there's been a revolution in our way of communication and collaborations. You know, the smartphones, and that's not such a long time. So are there new ways of involving this kind of collaborative communication? I mean, on skin diseases, you have even apps on the smartphones to make pictures and so on. There seem to be a lot of bottom-up approaches of patients. Has this been considered? Is it being built in, or was this just not so visible for me?
You want to answer, Kate?
I think, if I can mention the new IMI project. So the IMI have a patient involvement strategy within their group, and that's gaining momentum at the moment, so it's evolving. And there's a new IMI call that came out late last year for patient involvement project, kind of similar to a EUPATI, not the same. So they're really looking at their projects and how they can make sure that patient involvement is a strategic thread all the way through. So I think you'll see more projects like that and more groups and collaborators like that actually bringing patient voice into it. It's going to take time, but hopefully we'll get there, and we'll see those examples coming through.
Very short comment on that question. I was involved in the external advisory board of an early IMI project looking into improving pharmacovigilance research methodology, and they included the patients in there, and this was rather challenging because nobody knew what to do with the patients in the project, and we really struggled, and we really struggled. We had a hard time. This needs to be thought about in the beginning when you actually form a consortium. Then it's much easier and much more natural. You shouldn't come when this consortium is set up and running.
And of course, technology is also an important point that is used more and more. We need to, yes, use more and more to make sure that, but the question is how to bundle that, how to get that solved. Yes, please, sir.
Yeah, comment and also a question that I wanted to make is it's not really a sentiment to involve patients. We, of course, have proposed that patients are co-developers. And it's also important in an economic context, because if we define clinical endpoints and define surrogate endpoints and include wearable devices into this, of course, they have to be calibrated and validated. That's still a process in progress. Also to consider the safety of cybersecurity and things like that plays a role. But patient-reported outcome, patient surrogate endpoint in terms of defining trial development and including patient feedback and patient-reported outcome research into this is very important. Patient preferences play an important role for how devices are reimbursed. For example, minimal invasive glaucoma surgery, they have devices, and there's a debate whether this is truly beneficial and in which patient subpopulation is it? Is it age dependent and such? There are critical elements that cannot be conducted without patient involvement and the patient reported outcome research. And of course, as you may have mentioned, the Picori Institute, the Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute, is something that has had a strong attention, and we want to make sure also that in an international framework that the consideration and recognition thereof is not declining because in our somewhat changed administration that doesn't receive the same consideration, particularly not for funding, and that's something I wanted to make sure that people understand. Of course, we do have to learn a lot, and it's a research that's ongoing, particularly when we think of the validation of that, and I think the return of investment is another consideration, where we all know that our clinical trials are too expensive, and surrogate endpoint definitions and shortening the trial time with specifically validated endpoints that come from patients are certainly the right direction to take. So it's not an option, it's an obligation, and it's an absolute necessity. And we cannot but to continue that very important research and also continue to enhance the outreach and engagement through all the tools that we have available.
Thank you very much. That's extremely important that you raised that. We have new opportunities by bringing in now, also through the social media and the IT environment, a much larger cohort of patient-reported outcomes, patient data that in the normal technical quality, the normal clinical trial environment with 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 patients is extremely difficult to organize and very expensive, but with using these patient-reported outcomes in a sophisticated, intelligent way, a lot of data can be generated, and this way provide much more solid evidence of the different parameters, values, and the things that are of relevance to patients. And companies that are smart enough to utilize that have certainly a very good, also competitive advantage, because the enthusiasm from the patients is there. It's really interesting how many patients really, really want to help, want to provide information, and are just looking for ways how to do that. So I think it's a matter of being smarter than others, and really know exactly what you need and what you want to have, and then find a way how to enable that. I see the master of the ceremony cutting us off. So I thank you very much. I hope it was, despite the fact that it's so late in the evening, still some food for thought. I think you will have also some opportunities now to get it a bit swimming in the wine, these thoughts, so that it's hopefully getting further and get into your dreams. But it should definitely not be a dream. It should be reality. It should be natural and normal. And personally, I think, as we have nowadays, what we did not expect in the 80s, that every pharma company has outsourcing as a key strategy. I think in 10 years from now, involving patients will be a fundamental strategy that nobody is doubting anymore, whether it's necessary or not. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the speakers, and thank you for your attention.